The biting winter wind whistled through the towering glass skyscrapers of the city, but inside the grand lobby of Harris Enterprises, the air was warm, smelling of expensive mahogany and fresh lilies. Arthur stood in the center of this magnificent lobby, clutching a worn-out leather folder to his chest. His faded jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and his boots, though meticulously polished, showed unmistakable signs of years of wear. Arthur was 34 years old, but the heavy lines around his eyes made him look much older. He was a single father, and his entire world revolved around his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. For the past 6 months, Arthur had faced a relentless string of bad luck. The factory where he had worked for a decade had suddenly shut down, leaving him and hundreds of others stranded without a safety net. Since then, he had applied for dozens of jobs, ranging from warehouse work to retail, but his lack of a college degree always resulted in the same cold, automated rejection emails. Today was different. He wasn't here to apply for a corporate desk job. He was here to apply for the position of a night shift janitor. It was a humble job, but it offered a steady wage and, more importantly, health insurance that would cover Lily's chronic asthma medication. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous fluttering in his stomach, and walked up to the sleek, marble reception desk. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a sharp designer suit, looked up from her computer screen. Her eyes quickly scanned Arthur's worn jacket and hesitant posture, her expression shifting from professional warmth to cold indifference. Arthur cleared his throat and spoke softly, saying he was here for the janitor interview that was advertised online. The receptionist sighed, tapped her acrylic nails against the desk, and told him to take a number and wait in the corner. Arthur nodded gratefully, taking the small slip of paper, and walked over to the designated waiting area. He sat down on the edge of a plush leather couch, feeling entirely out of place among the elegantly dressed executives and sharp-clothed managers walking past him. He opened his folder to look at his resume one last time. It was a simple piece of paper, detailing his years of hard, physical labor and his commitment to reliability. At the very top, printed in a clean, bold font, was his full name, Arthur Pendleton. As Arthur waited, his mind wandered back to his small, cramped apartment where Lily was currently staying with Mrs. Higgins, their kind elderly neighbor. This morning, Lily had hugged his neck tightly and whispered that he was the smartest, strongest daddy in the world and that he would get the job. Arthur had smiled and kissed her forehead, promising her that everything would be okay, even though his heart was heavy with anxiety. If he didn't secure a job this week, they would face eviction. The weight of that reality felt like a mountain on his chest. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the executive elevator slid open, and a hush fell over the busy lobby. Everyone stopped talking and stood a little straighter. Walking out of the elevator was a man surrounded by an entourage of assistants, lawyers, and security guards. This was Christian Harris, the 36-year-old billionaire CEO of Harris Enterprises. Christian was a legend in the business world, known for his ruthless efficiency, sharp intellect, and cold, unyielding demeanor. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room with absolute authority. He was reviewing a set of financial reports handed to him by his chief assistant, nodding curtly as he walked toward the main exit. Christian's path took him directly past the reception desk and the waiting area where Arthur was sitting. Arthur watched the powerful man approach, feeling a wave of humility. They were the same age, yet their lives were worlds apart. One commanded a global empire, while the other was praying for a chance to mop his floors. As Christian reached the reception desk, he paused to sign a final document. The HR manager, who was holding a stack of applications for various open positions in the building, rushed up to Christian to get a signature for the new hiring budget. In her haste, she bumped slightly against the edge of the desk, causing her clipboard to slip. A few papers fluttered to the polished marble floor, landing right at Christian's feet. The HR manager gasped, instantly turning pale, and began apologizing profusely as she scrambled to pick them up. Christian frowned, his strict demeanor making the entire room tense up. He bent down to pick up one of the papers that had slid closest to his custom-made leather shoes. It was a standard, single-page resume meant for the cleaning department. Christian's eyes casually glanced at the page, intending to simply hand it back and continue his walk to his waiting limousine. But as his gaze reached the top of the paper, his entire body went completely rigid. Christian froze mid-motion, his breath catching sharply in his throat. The assistants around him stopped talking, exchanging confused and worried glances. The billionaire CEO, who was famous for never losing his composure, was staring at the paper as if he had just seen a ghost. His hands began to tremble slightly, a sight that shocked his personal security detail. The name printed at the top of the resume seemed to burn into his vision, Arthur Pendleton. Christian stood up slowly, his face turning incredibly pale. He ignored the HR manager, ignored his assistants, and ignored the ringing phones in the lobby. He slowly turned his head, his eyes scanning the waiting area with an intensity that was almost terrifying. There, sitting on the edge of the leather couch, was Arthur. Arthur was watching the scene unfold with wide, confused eyes, wondering why the billionaire CEO was suddenly staring directly at him. Christian took a step forward, his legs feeling heavy, as 20 years of memories rushed back into his mind in a single second. The entourage moved to follow him, but Christian raised a hand, commanding them to stay back with a sharp gesture. He walked across the marble floor, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. As Christian drew closer, Arthur began to recognize something in the CEO's sharp features. The expensive suit, the groomed hair, and the aura of immense wealth had masked it at first, but now, looking closely into those piercing blue eyes, Arthur's breath caught too. He recognized that look. He recognized the slight scar near Christian's left eyebrow. 20 years ago, long before the billions of dollars, the skyscrapers, and the fame, Christian was not a powerful tycoon. He was a scrawny, terrified 16-year-old boy living in a broken foster home on the rough side of the city. He had been a target for local bullies, a kid with no friends, no family, and no hope for the future. One rainy evening, a group of older boys had cornered Christian in a dark alley, beating him mercilessly for the few dollars he had in his pocket. They would have severely injured him if it hadn't been for another teenager who happened to be walking by. That teenager was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur wasn't a fighter, but he possessed an immense sense of justice and a deeply kind heart. Without hesitating, Arthur had thrown himself into the fight to protect the stranger. He had taken a brutal beating alongside Christian, but his fierce intervention eventually scared the bullies away. Afterward, instead of walking away, Arthur had helped Christian up, wiped the blood from his face, and walked him all the way to a small local diner. Arthur had used his last $5 to buy Christian a warm bowl of soup and a slice of bread. For the next 2 years, Arthur became Christian's protector, his older brother figure, and his only true friend in the world. Arthur encouraged Christian to study, shared his own meager meals with him, and constantly reminded him that he was smart and destined for great things. But when they turned 18, the foster system separated them, and life's chaotic currents pulled them down completely different paths. Christian had managed to secure a scholarship, working night and day with a fierce, desperate ambition to escape poverty, eventually building the massive empire he owned today. Arthur, bound by his own family responsibilities and hardships, had stayed in the working-class trenches, eventually becoming a devoted father but falling into financial despair. Christian had spent years trying to find Arthur once he became wealthy, but because Arthur had moved across states and kept a low profile after his wife passed away, the search had always turned up empty. And now, by some incredible twist of fate, the man who had saved his life and believed in him when no one else did was sitting in his lobby, applying to clean his toilets. Christian stopped right in front of Arthur. The silence in the lobby was so profound that you could hear a pin drop. The employees watched in absolute amazement as their billionaire boss stood before a man in a frayed jacket. Christian looked down at the resume in his hand and then looked up, his voice cracking with an emotion none of his staff had ever heard before. He whispered, "Arthur. Is it really you?" Arthur stood up slowly, his knees shaking slightly. A warm, emotional smile broke through his tired face, and he replied softly, "Hey, Christian. You grew up." Before Arthur could say anything else, Christian dropped the folder and threw his arms around him, embracing his old friend in a tight, emotional hug. The entire lobby gasped in unison. The receptionist's jaw dropped, and the HR manager stood frozen in sheer disbelief. The cold, ruthless billionaire was hugging a janitor applicant with tears shining in his eyes. Christian pulled back, holding Arthur by the shoulders, looking at his worn clothes and the tired lines on his face. Christian asked what he was doing here, looking at the application. Arthur looked down, a bit embarrassed, and explained that times had been very tough, that his factory had closed down, and that he was just trying to find a way to provide for his daughter, Lily, and afford her medicine. He added that he just needed a job, any job, to keep a roof over their heads. Christian felt a sharp pang of sorrow in his heart, followed immediately by an overwhelming wave of determination. He looked Arthur dead in the eyes and said that his searching days were over. Christian turned around to face his entourage. The HR manager stepped forward nervously. Christian handed her Arthur's resume and announced in a loud, commanding voice that the janitor interview was officially cancelled. He declared that effective immediately, Arthur Pendleton was appointed as the Vice President of Community Relations and Corporate Welfare for Harris Enterprises, with a starting salary that made the HR manager's eyes widen in shock. The position came with full executive benefits, top-tier family health insurance, and a housing allowance. The HR manager stammered, mentioning company policy and background checks, but Christian cut her off with a sharp, icy glare, stating that Arthur's character was the highest qualification this company had ever seen, and his word was final. Christian then turned back to Arthur, who was standing there utterly speechless, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. Arthur protested, saying he didn't know anything about being a vice president or working in a corporate office. Christian smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Arthur's shoulder, and told him that his job would be to find honest, hard-working people who were struggling, just like they used to be, and give them the resources, jobs, and opportunities to succeed. Christian added that nobody in the world had a bigger heart or a better understanding of what people truly needed than Arthur. He said that Arthur had saved his life and given him a future 20 years ago for the price of a $5 bowl of soup, and it was finally time for him to pay his debt. Christian immediately cancelled all his meetings for the rest of the day. He ordered his personal chauffeur to bring the limousine around. He looked at Arthur and told him they were going to pick up Lily right now, move their belongings out of that cramped apartment, and celebrate over the biggest, finest dinner the city could offer. As the two men walked side by side out of the grand lobby, the employees stood in silence, deeply moved by the incredible display of loyalty and gratitude. Arthur looked out the glass doors at the bright winter sun, his heart overflowing with relief and joy. He knew that his days of struggling in the dark were finally over, and his daughter would have the beautiful life she deserved, all because a seed of kindness he had planted 20 years ago had finally blossomed into a forest of hope.